Hi folks, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Now this video is going to be an explanation of my interpretation of the literature surrounding the link between stress, inflammation and the development of mood disorders like anxiety and depression. And I wanted to make this video because I think it explains the reason that certain supplements and certain foods are consistently useful against the development of depression and anxiety and can be used consistently to be able to improve mood disorders, and why certain supplements only work on certain individuals under certain circumstances. I get a lot of questions about l-tryptophan, and this is one supplement that does appear to have variability between individuals, and I wanted to do this video because I think it explains why l-tryptophan only works for certain people. Now, to be able to understand why l-tryptophan is a bit variable in its results at treating mood disorders, you have to understand how mood disorders develop. Now, like I say at the start of the video, this is my interpretation of the literature, and this is my understanding of how that literature could be formulated together to create a hypothesis. This doesn't mean this is correct, and other people may have other opinions, but this is my opinion, and I think it fits quite nicely with the results that you get from certain treatments. Now, mood disorders develop in certain individuals. Clearly some people are susceptible to them, and certain people appear to be very resilient to them. And so therefore the first thing we can say is that there is a genetic variability. Some people genetically are just more likely to get mood disorders compared with others. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. You can't look at every individual the same. You have to accept that everybody's different. And some people are naturally more anxious than others. Some people are naturally more happy than others, and therefore mood disorders, you have to look at them on the background of this genetic variability. That being said, there are certain triggers, environmental triggers, that will cause the development of mood disorders. Now really, mood disorders start when a person is exposed to some kind of stress. Now, stress is something that's perceived, so a stress that will cause a reaction in one person may not cause a reaction in another. We all react to different things in different ways, and therefore it's very difficult to actually say what that stress could be. But some common examples could be the death of a relative, pressure at work, a shortage of money. There are many things in modern life that we're exposed to that can cause what we call environmental stresses. Now those stresses are something that causes the body to release certain hormones, and in humans the main stress hormone that is released when we're exposed to an environmental stress, which we could call a stressor, is cortisol. Now animals do the same thing. Obviously the stressors in animals are different because they don't have complex societies, but you could take a rat and you can expose it to various conditions, and that to the rat would be a stressor, and they don't release cortisol, but they release a very similar hormone called corticosterone. So if you're reading the literature and you're reading about corticosterone, that is just the animal version of cortisol, and effectively they're interchangeable. They're the same type of hormone. They behave in the same kind of way. It's just that humans don't produce corticosterone, they produce cortisol. So we're exposed to a stressor, an environmental stressor. That is a perceived stressor, and if you are susceptible to it, you may release cortisol. Now what cortisol does is it causes, through a complex series of biochemical changes, it causes an inflammatory pathway to be, an inflammatory process to be begun in the brain tissue. Now, one thing to understand about cortisol and all of these reactions is that they are perfectly natural. They're actually a defense mechanism. Cortisol is seen as a bad thing, but really it is there to protect us. The problem comes when we're exposed to stress in a chronic way. We're not supposed to be stressed chronically. So let's go back to our animal model. We take a rat and we put that rat in a situation where it feels distressed, and we expose it to a stressor, that rat will react by releasing cortisol. If you then take that rat away from that distressing situation and you put it back in its normal environment, its hormones will take a while to settle down, but they will ultimately settle down, and there should be no long-term effects on that rat. The problem comes when you expose the rat constantly to that environmental stressor. There is no return, no homeostatic return to normal levels for the stress hormone. The stress hormone continues to be released, and it's at that point that damaging, long-term damaging effects occur in the brain of the animal. And it's exactly the same with humans. Exposure to stressors, environmental stresses, is not necessarily a bad thing. We release cortisol. That cortisol is a natural reaction, and if we remove that stressor, our homeostatic mechanisms will eventually lower the cortisol, and we will go back to what we would consider a normal metabolic regulation. But that we all know that often doesn't happen. When we're exposed to a stressor, that stressor can sometimes be a long-term chronic thing, and that is where the damage starts. So really, mood disorders start with exposure to chronic stress, and that sometimes needs to be emphasized. Exposure to things like, exercise is a stressor. If you do too much exercise, it can actually cause mood disorders. Overtraining is known to be associated with depression. So any type of stressor that takes your body too far out of its normal homeostatic regulation can trigger mood disorders. And we all know the sort of things that do trigger mood disorders. Most people know the cause of their unhappiness or their anxious feelings. And this is why I've always said removing the stress is the first real step in treating mood disorders, because that's the actual root cause. So when the cortisol, the corticosterone in animals is released, there's this inflammatory process that occurs in the brain, and there's a complex series of chemical changes, and there's a number of inflammatory markers that are released into the brain. You see reactive protein, there's interleukins as well, they're released, and this causes inflammation in the tissues of the brain. Now, one of the byproducts of inflammation is the generation of free radicals. So this would be, it doesn't happen just in the brain, it happens in all tissue. Whenever there's inflammation, it's always associated with the generation of free radicals. That's the byproduct of that process. And if that stress is chronic and that inflammatory process continues to occur, those free radicals continue to accumulate, and they lead to the generation of oxidative stress. Now, we have antioxidants in our brain, we have antioxidants in all our tissues that can quench free radicals, but we have a finite capacity to do that. Those free radicals will eventually, if they continue to be generated, they will overcome the antioxidant defenses of the cells. And it's at that point that tissue damage starts to occur. And it's really at that point that mood disorders, if we had to pick a point where mood disorders would start, it's at that point that the mood disorders would begin, because tissue damage is occurring, and it's occurring in the brain. Now, the problem with the brain is that it's made of lots of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are particularly susceptible to free radicals. So generation of inflammation and free radicals and oxidative stress in the brain is particularly damaging. And there are particular areas of the brain that have been found to be susceptible to these types of changes. And certain areas of the hippocampus in the brain appear to be particularly susceptible to these changes, and this is really the part of the brain that is probably most affected by this type of process. Now, what occurs as a result of this tissue damage? You tend to get a disruption to normal neurotransmission. So we have a very complex system of neurotransmitters in our brain, and that is usually in balance, and we produce the amount that we need, and that's for the regulation of the brain. Well, what happens is when tissue damage occurs, and tissue damage in the brain would be damage to the neurons, you tend to get a disruption to normal neurotransmission. So you may get too much of certain neurotransmitters produced in certain areas and too little in other areas, and this causes an imbalance between areas of the brain. And this is really the root cause of the feelings that we get when we have anxious feelings or depression. Now, whether you develop anxiety or depression depends on a number of factors, and it appears that the factors are based on genetic susceptibility. Some people are going to be more likely to develop anxiety, and some people may be more susceptible to depression. It depends on the type of stress that you're exposed to and how you perceive that stress, and it also depends on other environmental factors like your diet, whether you've been exposed to the stress before. There are a number of factors, but anxiety or depression, or both, can occur as a result of many factors, but they generally have a common etiology, a common cause, and that is stress, inflammation, and the generation of free radicals. And as those free radicals become more overwhelm the defenses of the cellular antioxidants, they then start to cause tissue damage, and ultimately that damages the neurons, and the levels of neurotransmitters in the brain become disrupted. Now, this comes back to this now explains really why certain foods, certain supplements, tend to be very consistently beneficial at treating mood disorders. Let's look at some of those supplements. Generally, plant foods are consistently show very good results against anxiety and depression. Generally, essential fatty acids, particularly omega-3 fatty acids, show very good consistent results against depression. And generally, antioxidants in general, antioxidants like vitamin C, also show very consistent results against anxiety and depression. And also anything that's anti-inflammatory also appears to have a beneficial effect. And this is explained by the fact that we have an inflammatory process which is generating free radicals, causing oxidative stress as the root cause of the anxiety and depression. So any food that you take that contains antioxidants, that contains anti-inflammatory compounds, is going to be consistently beneficial at protecting against mood disorders. Plant foods are full of antioxidants, they're full of anti-inflammatory compounds, and this is why high plant food diets are so protective of mood disorders. Vitamin C, even vitamin C powder, any antioxidant that you can take is going to be beneficial for that reason. And this also explains why certain supplements are a little bit more inconsistent. Something like l-tryptophan that people take can work very well in certain people at treating certain mood disorders, whereas in others it has no effect or can even make the situation worse. Now, the reason for this is that the l-tryptophan, as you'll probably know, is converted to serotonin ultimately in the brain, and that can increase serotonin levels. Now, that will work if you have a deficiency of serotonin. The trouble is that not all people with anxiety or depression have a deficiency in serotonin. And like I said, the changes that occur to the neurotransmitters in the brain are far more complex than a simple increasing or lowering. One area can have an increase in a particular neurotransmitter, another area can have a decrease. And therefore, really, it's a very hit and miss tactic to be able to take a supplement that will simply increase serotonin, because there's no guarantee that it will increase serotonin in the correct area, or it could increase serotonin in an area of the brain where you already have too much serotonin. In other words, you may actually make it worse. And this is why amino acids are not so consistent, I think, in the ability to treat mood disorders. In fact, I find that certainly l-tyrosine and l-tryptophan do appear to make mood disorders worse in certain individuals. And I think this is the reason, really, you're trying to treat the symptoms rather than treating the cause of the disorder. It would be far better to try and treat the rather than trying to modulate neurotransmission. It would be better to try and prevent that damage to the neurotransmitters by taking antioxidants. And of course, the free radicals are produced by inflammation, so therefore it would be better to actually treat the inflammation by taking anti-inflammatory compounds. And of course, the inflammation is caused by stress, so ultimately the best solution is to avoid that stress. And this is going back to my rat model. If you put the rat in a distressing situation, it will have cellular changes that will cause damage. But as soon as you take that rat away from that damaging environment, it might take a certain amount of time, but there will be a homeostatic regulation that will take all of the hormones back to normal levels if you allow that rat enough time. So this is, time is a good healer, it's true, and removing the stress is ultimately the best way to treat mood disorders. But that doesn't mean that plant compounds can't be used. A combination of both is usually the best way. But I think that nicely explains why amino acids sometimes have hit and miss effects. And I wanted to make this video because I do get a lot of comments from people that take l-tryptophan, and it appears that roughly half the people that comment seem to say it's beneficial, roughly half the people say it actually makes them worse, and I think that's possibly the reason. One other thing to think about is the fact that anti-inflammatory compounds are very beneficial at treating mood disorders, and plants are very good anti-inflammatories. There are many compounds in plants that act as anti-inflammatories. One of the best anti-inflammatories is turmeric, and turmeric has been shown to be beneficial at treating anxiety and depression in humans and animals. So and it's very, a very good antioxidant as well. And I think that kind of probably explains why those types of particularly herbs and spices that have those anti-inflammatory effects, compounds like garlic, are beneficial at treating mood disorders. The last thing to say is possibly to have I think that one of the areas of research that will occur over the next few years is that the cat will be let out of the bag, that I think we have been misled as to how antidepressant drugs work. You'll be aware that there are many antidepressant drugs called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, selective noradrenaline reuptake inhibitors, selective dopamine reuptake inhibitors. These drugs, we are told, these antidepressants are told work because they modulate neurotransmission, and that may be true. They may well. Evidence does show that obviously selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors do increase serotonin in certain levels of the brain, and we're told that's the primary mechanism, by the way, that they work. And this is you can pick this up in comments and videos on these drugs, and we're told that that this modulation of neurotransmitters, and even looking at the older antidepressants, they tended to inhibit things like monoamine oxidase, which had this modulatory effect on neurotransmission in the brain. Now, I don't think that's the way that these compounds are treating individuals. If you look at the chemical nature of these pharmaceuticals, it's a very strange coincidence that they are all very good antioxidants. Now, a number of chemistry papers have looked at the chemistry of these antidepressant drugs that are prescribed to a wide number of people in the populations, and these chemical studies have shown that consistently these antidepressant drugs are antioxidants. And this is, I think, why they possibly are effective, not because they are able to regulate the levels of neurotransmitters. And of course, it could be that some of the regulation of the neurotransmitters, so for example, if you take drug A, it increases serotonin levels, and we're told that's the reason it works. Well, perhaps it raises serotonin levels because it's an antioxidant, and the antioxidant effects of the drug are actually stabilizing the brain, they're stabilizing that inflammatory process. That's causing the neurotransmitters in the brain to return to normal levels, and a byproduct of that is that maybe serotonin levels increase. So I don't think we've been told the whole truth about these antidepressant drugs and how they work. I think I do believe the drug companies know how these drugs work, but if they told you that they were working simply because they're antioxidants, you'd just go and take some vitamin C. It'd have the same effect. And this is why when you look at the comparison of many of these drugs, and nearly every single one of these drugs has been compared to various nutrients, it is very, very common to find that the nutrient is as effective as the pharmaceutical drug. No difference between the two compounds. And if they're both antioxidants and they're both working in the same way, that would explain why they have very similar effects. However, it is very interesting that many of the drugs do tend to have side effects, whereas when they're compared to the plant compounds tend not to have the same level of side effects. That's not to say that isolated plant compounds are free of side effects. Certainly when you isolate compounds from plants, in my opinion, you are creating drugs. They might be natural drugs, but they are pharmaceutical products. But when you compare isolated drug compounds that have been synthesized to whole plant extracts in terms of their ability to act against anxiety and depression, there are a multitude of studies that have done this, and there is so much evidence that the plant compounds are as often as effective as the antidepressant pharmaceuticals, but yet they don't have the same level of side effects, which is very interesting because again it shows the intelligence of nature. It shows the the harmony between plants and animals, and how the plants are really integral to the health of animals, and I don't think that's really emphasized enough. The chemistry and the biochemistry, the chemical link between the two is very intricate, and we can include bacteria in that because bacteria communicate with our cells in our gut. Bacteria are integral to our immune system, so there is this symbiosis between plants, animals and bacteria, and the all of these three types of organisms are really closely reliant on each other. So that's very interesting, worthy point to finish on, I think. So if you do have a mood disorder, my advice, my general advice, is that you should be eating a very high plant food diet. You should be removing all the compounds in your diet, all the foods in your diet that can cause inflammation. You should be minimizing your exposure to free radicals, pollution, smoking, stress, and of course you should be getting rid of the stressor that is ultimately causing your mood disorder. It is sometimes difficult to identify it. Keeping a diary of things and how your mood changes may be a good way of doing that. But generally, most people's mood disorder is caused by a series of very small stresses, and it's very difficult to actually identify the trigger that caused the mood disorder, because these stresses are so small that individually they wouldn't have had an effect, but when you combine them and you're exposed to them constantly, that can cause a mood disorder. Obviously, in certain people, a very big stressor like the death of a spouse or something along those lines, it becomes obvious. But for most people, the stresses are very small. Somebody bullying you at work that you don't realize it's really bullying, a long commute into work that you don't really like, a job that you've fallen out of love with. These little things can mount up and they can start to affect you without you realizing it. And you don't realize until perhaps you moved out of the situation and you look back and you think, I realize now how much that was affecting me. So trying to identify the stresses is a very important thing, even though sometimes it can be very difficult. And of course, healthy diet to go with that all the time, not just for your mental health but also for your physical health. So I hope you found that interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.